The history of corsets. Now, this is something that you never knew you wanted to know about, but what I'm about to tell you is so mind-boggling, you won't believe it. But I promise you, everything I'm about to tell you over the next few minutes is absolutely true, and you will never look at a corset in the same way ever again. Stick with me, the information you're about to hear barely anybody else knows, so you can repeat it at any time in the future and for the rest of your lives, and I guarantee you it'll make you sound like a very interesting person. Yes, you will, because by the end of this video, you will know that corsets can not only change the look of a human body, they can fundamentally change the human body's inner workings by shoving its organs from one place to another in an uncomfortable way. You'll discover that terms we use today in modern life, like loose women and being straight-laced, they were spawned from the 19th century corset wearers. You'll know by the end of this that men of the 19th century adored corsets almost as much as women, so much so that many men died, as did women, dropping dead in the street because of their corsets. And then you'll hear of absolute fashion nightmares for anyone wearing a corset in the jungle. So let's start at the beginning. Corsets in one form or another have been around for centuries, but it was during the 19th century that the corset that we understand today really came about. When I say the one we understand today, actually, we wouldn't understand the 19th century corset because it was so extreme, it was shockingly painful, and I mean painful, literally so painful, it was unbearable for some. So unbearable, in fact, that they died wearing corsets because the corset was so painful that it crushed them to death. So let's chat about the 19th century ladies of fashion, particularly the British ladies of fashion. They came up with what we now refer to, and they did then in fact, as the British Empire silhouette shape. This was the shape of a lady of fashion. And that shape during the 19th century was the classic hourglass, the kind of hourglass figure shape you might now consider to be more 1950s. Well, no, it's more 1870s onwards. The hourglass was the figure shape to have. But of course, you know that the Victorians were known for being incredibly modest. Yes, well, on the surface. So a lady's form, the figure, the body, was well and truly covered from the neck down to the ankles. But the silhouette, the empire silhouette, of course, was on show. And you, as a lady of fashion, wanted to show off your silhouette. And just like today, when you study history, you'll realize that nothing actually changes. There were tricks and methods during the 19th century to enhance certain areas of the body and disguise others. And the Victorian ladies did this very cleverly by padding out their shoulders, big shoulders, and their hips, big hips, which gave the impression of a small waist. Which was all well and good, but if you really wanted to master the extreme hourglass shape, then you needed to employ a corset to pull the waist in to nail it properly. And they didn't half nail it. Those corsets of the 19th century were extreme in the extreme. And don't think for one moment that it was just the 19th century ladies that were employing these extreme corsets, because that's not true. The men of the period also wore corsets, maybe not as many as the ladies, but many did, and often as extremely as the ladies. And I'll give you an example later on of an extreme male corset wearer who literally took it as far as it would go. And the corsets were tight-laced. This was the term used to haul the corset in, and this is where we get the saying to be straight-laced. I'll explain that in a minute, but literally yards and yards of cord were attached to the lace, and it was hauled from all angles to a point where the wearer could just about breathe and survive the experience. Dieting, you might be surprised to hear, was actually popular during the 19th century, particularly with ladies who wanted to reduce their waistline to create that classic hourglass British silhouette shape. However, for some ladies, the natural way was just not dramatic enough. They wanted to take that waistline to extremes and create an unnaturally sized waist. A waist that would shock and awe when she moved in certain circles. That was the aim. Who could create the tiniest waist possible? So the only way to compress a human waistline to that unimaginably small size was with a corset and a system of tight lacing. And many ladies became so consumed with the idea of this tiny waist that they were almost addicted to the pain caused during the process of tight lacing. And it wasn't just a case of putting on a corset and tying it tight. A lady had to train their body literally over long periods of time to gradually reduce the waist down to the tiniest possible circumference. And this practice was called corset training. It wasn't just a case of ramming your body into a tight corset and job done. It didn't work that way. The body needed to be acclimatized to these tiny corsets. And to get that perfect silhouette shape, it took very many weeks. So a tight lacer, which a lady was referred to who wore tight laces, had to start at the beginner's level. And the beginner's level for a tight lacer was ordering a corset that was 4 inches smaller than their waistline. They'd breathe in, strap themselves into it. This they could cope with. The body could cope with that, but the lady would have to endure the discomfort of wearing this thing day and night for weeks, allowing the body to climatize itself to that constricting bit of material around the waist. All sounds pretty simple so far, doesn't it? However, there was a problem, and diagrams drawn by doctors at the time showed the internal effects of a corset just 4 inches too small for a lady, and those effects were quite dramatic. So at the same time that the waist on the outside was being compressed to create the perfect fashion shape, the organs inside the body were actually being shoved all over the place, moved up, down and sideways. Highly uncomfortable. Once the body had genuinely begun to change shape, because it really did, it wasn't just a case of pulling in the fat, it was a case of changing the whole body shape. This could take several months. Once the lady was accustomed to this and she was being able to cope with it, breathe and live a normal life, only at that point would she then introduce an even smaller corset and start the whole process again. By all accounts, in the scale of things, it wasn't that difficult to reduce the size of a human waist by 6 inches relatively easily. Let's say it might take a year of tight lacing, gradually getting smaller and smaller corsets to reduce your waist by 6 inches. However, over and above 6 inches, they reckon if you were able to continue, I mean literally able, as in you didn't just drop dead. If you wanted to continue, then it would take around 1 year to reduce the waist by a further inch. And some ladies continued until, guess what? Death. And if not death, at least very bad bouts of continual indigestion. I mean, can you imagine? It would be like feeling the way you feel after a Christmas lunch every single day of your life. But it didn't matter. There were endless accounts during the 19th century of ladies who really did take this tight lacing to the extremes. I mean, it really was a form of cosmetic body manipulation. it's the only way you can describe it. Today, women would go in for operations to reduce their waist. It actually wouldn't be allowed because it would be so health threatening. And on that subject, in fact, it didn't stop ladies, and as I'll mention a bit later, men doing this to themselves, even though the medical journals were giving evidence on a daily basis that this thing was so bad for your health. Newspapers were talking about it, the gossip pamphlets were talking about it, the public were talking about it. So a lot of these people, mainly women, some men, were actually being ridiculed for looking so ridiculously out of proportion. Again, not dissimilar to today with some extreme cosmetic measures celebrities take. The public often look in shock at what they do to themselves, but it doesn't stop them from doing it. People were literally addicted to causing themselves such discomfort, all in the name of fashion. But come on, suffering a little bit of discomfort for fashion is worth it, right? So a little bit of indigestion here, the odd crushed organ, occasionally fainting in public because you can't breathe because the corset was literally crushing your ribs. That's all okay if you're looking the business. But as I've mentioned, sometimes looking the business could actually cost your life. And there was one very famous case of a young lady who was so tight-laced and wearing a constant corset for long periods of time that two of the metal stays that held the corset together with body movements had been rubbing together potentially for months on end and quite literally sharpening one another. And then one unfortunate move of the body sent one of the metal stays, which was now effectively a razor-like sharp spear, straight through her heart and killed her on the spot. And then there was the case of a very famous male performer at the time, a female impersonator who had been making a very good living for decades, of course, impersonating a woman. The audiences thought he was hilarious, and by all accounts, he was. But if he was going to impersonate a woman, he had to have that empire silhouette of a woman. And of course, he created this by wearing a corset. He was a tight lacer. However, Joseph Henella was his name. Over the years, and the more successful he became, the more after-dinner parties he was going to. So he put his show on and then go out for a wild night eating and drinking. Unfortunately for him, this had a bad side effect. In other words, he got a bit porky. Now, with him being a bit porky, he needed to pull his corset in a little bit tighter. So much so, after one show, he collapsed. The doctors were called. He was taken to the hospital, and sadly, he died of kidney failure. The autopsy proved that tight lacing for many years caused poor Joseph's death. You can see then, for obvious reasons, there were lots of calls from all quarters for women and some men to stop this tight lacing, not just from doctors and the medical professions, but also from the church. They were involved. By all accounts, it was an abomination against God to wear a tight-fitting corset. And many women rebelled against the corset wearers. There was a group called the Victorian Dress Reform. It was more like a militant movement that came about in the later part of the 19th century. This was an all-female movement that were pushing and promoting the more sensible ladylike dress and really aggressively forcing their opinions on those ladies that were searching for the minuscule waist. This was against all Victorian morals, and there was a big fight between the two groups. So the anti-corset movement really took off, and those ladies that were involved in the anti-corset wearing movement even went as far as suggesting what ladies who were wearing corsets should actually wear. And so what they did, they took over shop windows in major cities and dressed mannequins in what they thought was the correct manner for a lady of the period. And so corset wearers were encouraged to go and window shop to show them, to teach them, to educate them how they should look in the eyes of God, the righteous and the moral. They even went as far as producing sewing manuals, workshop manuals, so ladies who were corset wearers could stop wearing corsets and sit at home like very well-behaved ladies in front of the fire and make their own outfits. They said this would make them far happier and much more satisfied with their lot. Now, of course, you can imagine what these outfits might have looked like. So first of all, picture in your mind the silhouette empire shape, the hourglass shape. Now picture in your mind the way the anti-corset wearers wanted ladies to look. Frumpy would be a very good way of describing the look that was advocated. So as you can imagine, the battle rolled on for quite some time. The corset wearers, the tight lacers, were just not willing to give in. They said that the style of dress demanded by the reformers was unattractive, unflattering, dull and boring. The reformers were insisting that a lady's waist should be natural. If it's expanded, that's okay, they said. Do not falsify the waist measurements. No tight lacer was willing to put up with this. The reformers wanted the tight lacers to look like them. The tight lacers said, we don't want to look like our grandmothers. The reformers said, looking like your grandmother would be absolutely ideal. It was stalemate. But moving on from the shores of Britain at the same time, corsets, of course, with ladies travelled around the world. This was the height of the British Empire, and it didn't matter where a lady may find herself, tropics, deserts, snow-capped mountains, it didn't make any difference. She had to look fashionable. And so there came some problems with travelling around the empire wearing a British-made corset. As a good example, get this. Imagine you're a lady and you're travelling across India, through the tropical landscape and the heat and the humidity, and you're wearing a corset. Now, you'll remember that these corsets are made with metal stays. Steel stays replaced the old-fashioned whalebones many years previously. Just really modern. This, of course, is the height of the Industrial Revolution. However, take a British-made corset with its steel stays, plonk it in the jungle, and what happens is this. The lady is sweating, or perspiring, as we might properly describe it, even though many ladies absolutely refuse to admit that they ever sweated at all. But they did. They're sweating in their corsets. The humidity, the temperature changes, causes the steel to actually rust. Rust, as we know, is a horrible mucky brown colour mixed in with the lady's sweat. This causes a runny mixture which is highly unattractive. The staining, the wet, damp patches come through the lovely crisp white blouses, causing the most horrendous, embarrassing, nightmare-filled stains running through the lady's dress that you can imagine. Fashion disasters beyond belief in the middle of the jungle. But getting away from fashion, I want to talk to you about two terms that we use on a regular basis in today's modern world, and they are directly related to corsets. I mentioned earlier on the term straight-laced. When you describe someone as being straight-laced, you imagine them to be upstanding, proper, refined, well-behaved, with good social manners. And the tight lacers, the corset wearers, coined this phrase because they said that if you were tightly strapped into a corset, you did indeed stand up straight and you had a proper gait. It also, they said, took a very long time to undo a corset, so you were highly unlikely to be a loose woman, which is another term spawned from the days of major corset wearing. The tight laces, the corset wearers, said that those ladies that didn't wear a corset nicely and safely strapped in were loose women because they could whip their clothes off very easily. So the battles raged between the reformers and the corset wearers, with accusations being thrown all over the place, and actually with really mixed and confused messaging, because the corset wearers were in a way suggesting that anyone who didn't wear a corset could be described as being a loose woman, and the loose women, the reformers, those that didn't wear corsets, were implying that really the corset wearers were indeed the loose women with their vanity and their attempts to attract male attention. It was never ending. Over time, though, towards the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, things began to change. There is no doubt that the reformers certainly had an influence on this, but the fashion for corsets began to wane. And in fact, in the early part of the 20th century, this is where we see the invention of the bra, which really changed the landscape for women completely. And corsets, bizarrely, began to get a reputation now, not for fashion in certain quarters, but for having a darkness to it. Even entering the world of fetish, which actually made the corset very appealing to a completely new market. And although this was a much smaller market, and of course one attracting a very different type of person, it was nevertheless, as you can imagine, a very fascinating sector of the market. And talking about fascinating, let me introduce you to the world's most famous tight lacer. This is Ethel Granger, an Englishwoman born in 1905. Fascinating lady. She was big into body piercing as well, but I won't go there. But she loved her corsets and she loved tight lacing. And she did it so successfully that she entered the Guinness Book of World Records. Ethel's figure measurements after several years of tight lacing ended up at being 36 across the top, 38 around the hips, and her waist measurement was 13 inches, a world record. And all thanks to that strange, funny garment we never talk about, the corset. I'm David Harper, thanks for watching. Come back again, do subscribe, like, make a comment, get in touch. Until next time, cheerio.